on tape. So let's start with base pay. Tom, is there a market standard in terms of how base pay is approached?
Well, we often get that question, that there is an answer out there. There is some answer as to how much, say, a CEO should be paid. But our approach is a little different. What we find, certainly compensation is related to position. It's also related to the stage of development of the company. So when we get asked that question, we often look then to see at our survey data to look at what the stage of development of the company is, how much revenue it has, number of employees. So I guess the basic answer is that there is no real one-size-fits-all answer. You can find them out there if you accumulate enough survey data. But what you'll find is that the earlier stage startups pay less, and as the company gets more developed, the compensation, including the base pay, will tend to rise.
And Ken, we've seen with a lot of companies, CEO-based salary staying flat in 2009, and as I said earlier, in some cases being reduced or being deferred. Where do your constituents think things are headed in 2010, and what have you been hearing from people?
So, as we probably talked about with a lot of people, we do a semi-annual salary survey, which we have a great amount of interest. We had 157 respondents when we did it in September. And basically, it showed what you'd expect, is that salaries and expected bonuses took a dip in 2009 from 2008. People are forecasting, what amounts to be a 5 or 10% increase in 2010 over 2009. I mean, one of the things we do see is that people tend to be optimistic about the future and realistic about the present. So people's expectations of their bonuses in 2009 are down and pretty realistic, and people's expectation of their bonuses in 2010 are pretty optimistic. And probably as we move into 2010, there may be a dose of realism. And I think we'll be talking about the whole concept of bonuses and how they're paid as another topic.
Maybe we can get a show of hands from people in terms of where they think compensation is going to go in 2010. In base salary, are people feeling like compensation is going to stay flat? Show of hands. How about increase? That's a little different than perhaps the survey information that you received. Yeah, Bill, with the market and financial conditions creating a situation where cash resources are limited and equity values are depressed, how are CEOs viewing base pay and the level of importance it has in their overall compensation packages?
First, let me just make one statement here that Ken is on my board, and so when I raised my hand saying that compensation would be flat next year, he was already writing that one down. So if you want someone to negotiate, I don't think I'm the guy, right? I think that, obviously your compensation is a function of base salary. In our case, there's a whole variable package associated with that, and then equity. I think that the reality with focus being on cash flow, cash management, liquidity issues. I certainly don't expect to see any changes in the sort of the baseline compensation. It's going to be, if anything, it's going to be focused on the variable side.
Tom or Ammar, how would you advise a CEO who's looking to negotiate their base salary and compensation package with the board to go about doing that? What kind of guidance would you give them in that process?
Look, I think as we look into 2010, I agree with Bill that it's people's expectations are with the economy coming back, there'll be more focus around how performance-based compensation is going to vary versus base salaries. And that's compensation is ultimately about performance and control and performance of the management team and the CEO and the company, and how you try to influence performance with incentives. That's the way I think about it. And I think as we go into any discussion with management teams, is sort of what's the plan and the ability to influence that plan or drive better performance than plan, and then compensation varies on that. Base salaries are one of those things that I think people don't like to be treated unfairly, but from where I sit, and of course I have a particular vantage point where you shouldn't be surprised by the perspective, is that base salaries are what should be market, but that's not where you're going to make money in a private company. And market is where the definition becomes tricky, right? Defining what market is where we can get into discussions, but the idea that you make a lot of cash comp on base, I think is antithetical to startups.
So taking from there, the question of market is a very good question. In public companies, it's pretty clear what market is because everyone has to file with the SEC and you have a full advantage of what everyone's making. In private companies, the data isn't as robust. There is no one clearinghouse that has everyone's information. So what you'd find, I think as a general principle, you really have to understand what your board is looking at as market. There are some very large surveys, but there are different ones that different investors use. So probably as a baseline to understand what market is to understand their perspective, what's their methodology, and then at least you understand and can speak their language. Because I find if you try and use, say, a different set of surveys than what they're looking at or what they consider appropriate, it usually is not going to be very effective.
And just to add some more color to that, by chance had a compensation committee call yesterday with one of my companies, and the data for a comp was sort of across all industries. And that's sort of not very useful because we're a very particular industry, and the idea that you're going to compare across a very broad swath of industries and compare it to tech doesn't make much sense. And that made that part of the conversation pretty short.
Yeah, I think another aspect of this is, are we talking about, recruiting a CEO to a company, and what's the negotiation on day one versus the ongoing management of it? Because I think on the front end, there's other factors in play. Where was that person coming from? What were they getting? How were they getting compensated before? What are their expectations going forward? And so I would think in a lot of companies that recruiting process ends up producing a kind of a customized result. But if anything, the expectation is going to be more on the equity side. And so, you end up, in some cases, trading down compensation in return for more equity if that's the way that you're motivated. And I think that gets the right alignment between the investor side and the management side if you're sort of all focused on the same outcome.
Maybe I'll just add one thing on base salary. We did this survey, and it's interesting to me that when you look at our survey and you look at a lot of the other surveys, we've seen the base salary component for companies that are beyond the startup stage and below the highly successful stage, I think they fall in a pretty narrow range. When you get down to what I think of as startups that might be bootstrapped, might have a few people, the way people are compensated, varies all over the map. And then when you get into much bigger companies, even the public companies, there's a lot of variation too.
What is that narrow range?
The narrow, I think the narrow range is for salaries of companies that have maybe 50 to 100 people. Is base salary is in the 200 range. These tend to be venture finance companies. I would say the low 200s, and there's obviously outliers on both ends, but
sort of plus or minus 50.
I'm glad you're negotiating with Ken, Bill. That's a pretty good number.
Yeah, I would say there is a wide range, especially at the early stage, for the reasons that William and Ken. Some because no one's looking at just base salary; they're looking at the total comp package and trading off. And second, just said it's a fragmented market. People come up with very different views.
Wouldn't you say that there is a likelihood that the CEO compensation packages are following what's general for senior executives? I'm noticing as I'm hiring senior executives that they are accepting base packages that are 20 to 40% lower than they would accept, 2 years ago. And wouldn't that be the same for CEOs? We have a stronger component of probably performance-based pay and a lower component of base pay.
I'll try to. I think I heard the question right about in the economy people are accepting lower base pay packages and higher component of incentive compensation. And on one hand, I think that makes a lot of sense. On another hand, the economy's improving. I see the economy improving and people's attitudes improving about that. I also sort of see that other hires, engineers and people like that, salaries and compensation seems to have bounced back for people in demand.